Today we're going to talk about MTSS. MTSS is the MTSS framework that's derived and designed for Oklahoma. MTSS stands for Multi-Tier System of Supports, and an MTSS framework is proactive and preventative. It integrates data and instruction to maximize student achievement and to support students' needs from a strength-based perspective. Most of the time that we think about MTSS, we think of the triangle that is comprised of the 3 tiers to the framework. Tier 1, which is universal or for all students. Tier 2, which is targeted for some. And Tier 3, which is intensive for few students. An MTSS system is comprised of these components that may look different at one school site versus another. It's proactive and preventative, meaning that it's really utilizing the staff, students, and community needs to help to align data and instruction to support high outcomes. MTSS is comprised of both RTI, or Response to Intervention, and PBIS, or Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports. Response to intervention is really measuring students' response through progress monitoring and aligned targeted skill interventions. Positive behavior interventions and supports is how we support students with these supports to improve overall behavioral outcomes. These are not competing for the effort of MTSS. These are working together and are aligned in a lot of their elements that make them supportive for schools. Why is this relevant for our schools so far? Why is this a necessary step? MTSS and special education have a rocky relationship. MTSS is not intended to be the flow for special education identification. It is not intended to be a tool where we push students from Tier 1 to Tier 2 to Tier 3 and then ultimately special education. However, it can be a tool to support child find, but its intended purpose is not to be this pathway for special education. Its purpose is to support students proactively, to identify that students have skill deficits academically or behaviorally, address those with evidence-based practices, utilize data decisions to make next step determinations, and then continue to reevaluate the system for any system-level changes. At any point in a student's process, whether they're Tier 1, 2, 3, receiving any form of services, a student can be considered for more specific supports. And the team at any process, at any time, can begin that process for special education eligibility. The key words to think about are the suspected disability. When we're having a supported MTSS process, we are not assuming that students in Tier 2 or Tier 3 automatically have a suspected disability. There are times in our lives as adults or when we were children that we maybe struggled and had skill deficits that needed additional support. An MTSS framework supports those particular needs until the threshold is crossed where the suspected disability may be persistent. And that's when a school may find that they are supported in their child find process. Why is this important for understanding the relationship between MTSS and special education? Well, for special education, when a student is then considered a student with a suspected disability, the team will then need to conduct the following: a review of existing data, or REDS. They'll need to gather parent consent for the pieces of information that they want to evaluate for. They'll begin the comprehensive evaluation, utilizing what was gathered in the parent consent, and then they'll host a multidisciplinary evaluation and eligibility group summary meeting, or a MEGS meeting, to determine eligibility. These are all of the current pieces that are necessary for a comprehensive evaluation. However, what we specifically are going to talk about is the elements that are required for a comprehensive evaluation. Now, in Oklahoma, we've identified these disability categories. And disability categories are different in different states. There are some states that have more disability categories and some states that have less disability categories. There's an asterisk on developmental delays because districts can choose if they want to utilize that category for students under 10 or not. But what's specific to our conversation with MTSS is specific learning disability. While there are all of these other categories, the only category that we're referring to is specific learning disability. And the specific learning disability comprehensive evaluation components in the policies and procedures for special education include the following required components: an academic achievement assessment, intellectual cognitive evaluation, adaptive behavior, developmental, background information and observation, any other intervention documentation, vision screening and hearing screening, and then any other additional requirements. These additional requirements come from the fact that districts can choose between which one of the two options that they'd like to utilize for eligibility determination. The first option that they can choose is a scientific research-based intervention model. The other option that they can choose is traditional discrepancy model. In the state of Oklahoma, the majority of our schools choose the traditional discrepancy model. It's the model that's most selected in the state. And the way that this model is typically conducted is that evaluators, qualified professionals, will use the students' cognitive assessment and their academic achievement assessment to determine if there's a 1.5 standard deviation discrepancy between these two assessments. That means that there needs to be about a year and a half of loss, or a year and a half of the student being behind for the student to be considered eligible under this model. There are pros and cons to this model. First, this model requires truly two assessments to determine if a student is eligible. While there are all of those other requirements, it's really relying on these two assessments. It's straightforward. The evaluator is really looking at just this. However, it requires students to be significantly behind. And usually that's far beyond after students have demonstrated that they are struggling. Across the globe, it's considered the wait to fail model because schools are ultimately waiting for a student to have this significant of a gap. The other model is the scientific research-based intervention model, which is also known as RTI. And RTI is one of those elements that's under an MTSS framework. The evaluation group to utilize this model must decide using a lot of different sources of data, demonstrating a lack of sufficient progress in response to scientific evidence-based interventions in one or more of the academic areas that are the concern. So there's two elements that the team would need to consider: whether the student's level of performance in the area of academic concern is significantly below what's expected for their grade and educational setting, and that the individual student learning requires resources beyond what can typically be provided in the general education curriculum in order for them to make adequate progress that's consistent with national or local growth rate comparisons. That second criterion is really important because that's not necessarily saying that a student is not making any progress. That's saying that the student needs to make adequate progress that we would consider is consistent with a student who does not have a suspected disability. There are national or local growth rate comparisons, and that's also important to note because when we're comparing this data, we're looking at the entire educational setting, the entire class, the entire school, the district. We're also looking at those national and growth rate norms to determine if a student is eligible. This is utilizing a significant use of data, much more comprehensive and aligned with what students are able to perform in their classroom. Why is this important? Because in 2032, schools are no longer able to select traditional discrepancy model. So that means that schools will have to select scientific research-based interventions for determining eligibility for SLD. So I think there's a lot of conversation about why MTSS is required from special education. It's not required because MTSS is the pathway for special education. It's recommended that schools begin their effective time to build these pathways and to build their intervention process before 2032 so that they're ready for these changes when they have a student who is eligible. For more specific information about utilizing RTI for eligibility, the Office of Special Education will be conducting additional trainings to support that. However, this particular training is going to specifically identify and talk about the components of MTSS, including the pieces that are determined in the OK MTSS framework. We'll talk about what these pieces look like, how you can implement them in your district and site, and where you can find additional resources to build your process. MTSS, the 5 domains, come from the MTSS Center. The MTSS Center has identified that these 5 components of MTSS are necessary for effective decision-making and effective infrastructure. The 5 domains are screening, progress monitoring, database decision-making, multi-level prevention system, and infrastructure. Of these 5 domains, the Oklahoma State Department took these pieces of information. We compiled all of the information that we utilize when we're working with school districts, and we determined that the framework that is most sustainable for Oklahoma includes sustainable teaming, data-driven decisions, evidence-based practices, and continuous school improvement cycle. As we talk about these components from the OK MTSS framework, you'll find that a lot of these components are interwoven with components from the 5 domains of MTSS. Let's talk about each of these pieces. As we're talking about each one, we'll give examples for how this may look in elementary and secondary, and examples for how this may look for academics and behavior. MTSS is comprised of an entire system, and so all of these pieces, you may find that your team or that your school is participating and practicing some of these elements quite effectively. It doesn't matter where you begin, just that you begin. Let's start with sustainable teaming. Sustainable teaming refers to the MTSS teams that procedurally are able to maintain forward momentum. These teams should leverage team capacity and community partners to create this team that supports ongoing effort. It's really important that these members are specific to the school site and district, that they should definitely know who those people, who the students are, who the teachers are. They need to have deep knowledge about that specific school. But we also need to consider specific personnel skill sets. So many schools in our state don't necessarily employ someone on site that would be considered their qualified examiner or their qualified professional. However, they may have somebody that they need to contract with for those specific personnel skill sets. They may also have somebody who is necessary to support them in another element that someone maybe at the school has that skill. For example, maybe you don't have someone whose job is data collection, but you may have a teacher who has a really deep knowledge and deep understanding of how to use Excel and can be able to conduct some simple data analysis. This team critically needs decision makers, and it needs a variety of representation. This representation, this MTSS leadership team, should not be comprised of only special education or only gen ed. It should not comprise of only elementary or only secondary. It needs to have a variety of information so that all of the components of the system are working. Those decision makers are most critical. Leadership support is even its own category and its own heading in OK MTSS. It refers to the administrator's involvement, and it's critical that that involvement is an active member, that the administrator is not only supporting ongoing and long-term planning, but they're also there to determine allocation of resources, and that they are an active member to support those decisions that need to be made to maintain forward progress. If the leader is isolating themselves from the actions of the team, or they give that leadership responsibility to somebody different, that is going to make their process very, very challenging to maintain forward momentum. In elementary and secondary, most critically, the master schedule organization for teachers and students is the administrator's most critical need. They need to be able to balance instructional time, intervention time, and also collaborative meeting times. They need opportunities to proactively support MTSS, meaning they need to make sure that MTSS efforts are a high priority. Those multidisciplinary teams are not only comprised of the leadership, but it should be an engagement with students, families, and community stakeholders. That doesn't mean that every meeting needs to be conducted with the same group of people, but that they should consider the purpose of each meeting and that they should consider who would best fit in each of those roles and those specific teams that they've developed. The team should develop feedback loops that support a multi-directional communication, meaning that the team is able to communicate to the administration and the administration is able to communicate to the team. This is really critical because any initiative needs that forward momentum and needs feedback to know if it's working. There are many different types of teams that schools can participate with. District level teams are those high level key stakeholders that are working on this planning and decision making at the district level. Site level teams focus on planning and implementation, taking what was determined at a district level and putting it at the site level. In small districts, district and site level teams are absolutely and can appropriately be the same team. An intervention team is really the teams that are working to directly make decisions about individual students. These teams may or may not be the same as a site level team. And in a large or small school, they may or may not host similar people from a district level team. These teams are fluid, and so it doesn't always have to be the exact same person and the exact same meeting, but they absolutely need to be effective. And effective meetings that are efficient need to have an agenda and an action plan. Everyone needs to know what their responsibility is and what the purpose of that meeting is. It is not helpful to have so many meetings that we don't understand why we're convening. So some recommendations: make sure that they're regularly scheduled meetings with an agenda and a clear understanding of the purpose of that meeting. Make sure that if we're sitting there for a district meeting or a site meeting, that we have a clear understanding of how that two-way feedback tool is going to be updated. Additionally, we should avoid considering informal meetings as an effective process. If I check on you in the hallway and I ask you how things are going, that is not an effective meeting, and it may not be communicated in a purposeful way. One of those two partners or participants may find that that meeting really wasn't sufficient. It's also not helpful to schedule so many meetings. So a weekly meeting for each of these things may be too much, but not enough meetings may be dramatically too few that we're not able to make forward momentum. And then if we don't have the ability to make comments or have feedback to one another, it's going to be very difficult to engage and continue to build that process. There are some additional supports that schools can choose to participate in, and each of these supports have varying levels of intensity and varying levels of effectiveness. Schools can choose to utilize an internal coaching through a district level or a site level support. This would be somebody that's hired with their intention to be the MTSS facilitator for the school and for the district. They would be the person to generate the meetings and to engage in that purpose. They would have some of those, if not all of the leadership requirements, and they may even have deeper knowledge than those who they are supporting. Having access to external MTSS coaching expertise could come from utilizing a program or a project that's housed at the State Department that would be free of cost for the district. Sometimes those are challenging to find because they have strict requirements for who's eligible. So that may not be available for everyone. Districts can access their own external MTSS coaching expertise from partners in the state or partners external to the state, and utilize some additional training from a third-party entity. But if neither of those options really are accessible for a school, then professional learning is absolutely a strong and supported opportunity. Professional learning really means that schools would be able to engage in additional understanding of each of these elements, and that they would send part of those teams to certain opportunities or to engage in virtual modules to broaden their knowledge. Professional learning is beneficial in a lot of ways because truly, if you're doing internal coaching capacity or access to external, you are engaging in a professional learning cycle. So accessing free or even low-cost professional learning could be really beneficial to your MTSS team. When we think about doing this for compliance, doing this because special education is moving away from traditional discrepancy, we have to really remember that just because something is compliance doesn't necessarily mean that we've really met with the spirit of and the purpose of why we're doing something. So if we are just doing something for the sake of compliance, we're going to be missing a lot of the purpose and the benefits of MTSS. It's really dependent that our teams are knowledgeable about the elements that we're going to talk about, because if they're not knowledgeable about these components, they're really going to face a lot of challenges to maintain a high quality, effective MTSS structure. So some components that just truly are typically barriers. Secondary teachers really do need to be trained in interventions that meet their students' skill deficits. So that means that if they have students that are performing significantly below grade level, they need to be trained in how to remediate those skills and intervene appropriately. And then both elementary and secondary teachers must be trained in data analysis to be able to use data effectively. We're not asking for teachers to then conduct these data analysis pieces, but they need to know how to effectively collect the data that's necessary to help make those next decisions. When we think about these interventions, and we've mentioned RTI, and we've mentioned these skill deficits, what we're really talking about is evidence-based practices. This is referring to the academic, behavioral, and mental health practices to support all students preventatively. And it should be consistently aligned between the district, site, and classroom. It should be something that is not competing between one another. So if the district has chosen some evidence-based practices, the site should not choose dramatically different ones. And the classroom should be following in those pieces. This is supportive because if I have a student who's gone from kindergarten all the way to 12th in a district, I want to be able to know what they've encountered the entire time. Districts and sites need to consider their core curriculum, how it aligns to state standards, and how it addresses their particular students' needs. And they can utilize these pieces of information to determine any next use of practicing with evidence-based instructional strategies. So let's talk about Tier 1, school-wide supports. Evidence-based practices begin with all students. So for academics, this includes our instructional practices, our instructional materials, and that it's aligned with standards. And for our behavior mental health, this is including that we're preventing some of these issues in a school-wide method. We're teaching how we want students to react and respond. We're reinforcing their positive behavior, and we're responding appropriately. Building all of these components helps to identify a positive school climate and culture, one that values high academic instruction and values student response. When we think about academics for English and math, we really need to think about that screener. And that screener is where it comes back around from those 5 domains of MTSS. We need aligned curriculum that's going to support our students to reach their state standards. And we need aligned instructional practices based on these school-wide data for student need. Aligned instructional practices really defines how we teach and what we're teaching. The next domain really is that progress monitoring tool. Many of our state-approved screeners for ELA also offer a progress monitoring tool in addition. Math screeners are also available where they include a screener and a progress monitoring tool. This progress monitoring tool is very sensitive, meaning it's going to give you data that's showing you those national norms, those local norms, so that you can make effective decisions if it comes up that you have a concern for a student. For behavior, a school-wide implementation looks like using common language. It looks like teaching school-wide expectations. It looks like reinforcing those expectations and using an aligned response process through the whole school. Many schools in the state have a mnemonic or an acronym that's aligned with their school mascot to create that aligned response process. They use language where everyone is utilizing the same expectation so that when a student is having a behavior concern, everyone knows how to respond to that student with the same method. But that's drilled down to each class, and each class is really providing for academics these high quality differentiated instruction, which is not an intervention. Differentiated instruction is supporting students for what they need. We're also preventing, teaching, and reinforcing, responding to those practices in the classroom, and these should not compete with the school-wide supports. So if we've identified a school-wide initiative that we're going to work on something, we're not going to do something different in our classroom. We're going to continue with that piece into the classroom. In academics, that looks like using common formative assessments. That looks like differentiation between different classes. That looks like using small group instruction and using higher intensity teaching strategies that are evidence-based, including explicit teaching, repeated opportunities for practice, reteaching, which is notable to mention that reteaching is not an intervention, multiple methods of instruction, and then frequent opportunities for feedback. These are really 5 incredible evidence-based strategies that work for both ELA, math, social studies, science, and support high-intensity education. For behavior, when we have our students in our class, we're building those relationships with all students to build this trust and respect. We're ensuring that we have active supervision so that students are safe before a behavior situation occurs, and that we're engaging them in high-quality evidence-based instructional strategies. If students are engaged in their learning, then they need less active supervision because they're participating in what we have deemed as active engagement. Engagement does not just mean fun things. Engagement means that they are attuned to their learning and that they are attuned to the skills that they're practicing with their teacher. We also need to teach behavioral supports for explicit instructions and how we want to correct those behaviors. We think we know we need to reinforce behaviors with specific praise. Some schools, especially in elementary, may find benefit with token economies, and in secondary may find benefit with group contingencies. These behaviors, how we reinforce them, can be specific to the school and specific to the class, but these particular elements should not compete with our school-wide initiatives. So this is really for everyone, and if we engage with everyone with high and effective practices, then we can notice when we have students who maybe are identified as needing additional support. We would consider them for a Tier 2 intervention. A Tier 2 intervention is going to be specific to those skill deficits with a standard protocol and is evidence-based. These particular interventions may be different from site to site and may be different from district to district. Because if I'm addressing specific skill deficits, and in one building I have specific skill deficits that are different from another, I may not necessarily consider that same skill deficit a Tier 2 in one building versus the other. So sometimes there's conversation saying, well, how do I know if it's a Tier 2 intervention? Tier 2 interventions are typically interventions that are going to utilize a standardized protocol, and the student is expected to make adequate progress within a reasonable amount of time. So students in Tier 2 interventions aren't going to be there for long. They're going to be there for maybe a quarter, maybe a semester, and they're going to be able to be demonstrating quite reasonable progress. We have some available interventions on the state website. If you type in OK MTSS, which in order for you to see this video, you are on that page. This particular page, if you scroll to the bottom, you'll be able to see our intervention library. These interventions do have some identification of Tier 2, Tier 3 targeted intervention versus Tier 1. Tier 1 interventions are typically, or Tier 1 protocols that are on here are typically more accessible for any subject area, but you can utilize your data to determine which types of protocols you need. They each come with a fidelity check, and you can then analyze this data to be able to see if a student is progressing appropriately using your progress monitoring tool. We have the same for behavior with the interventions, the fidelity check, and the ability to graph those behavior outcomes. So a Tier 3 intervention is really going to be that additional intensified support. It's going to be matched to an individual's needs. This is a student that either has a significant deficit right off the bat. We've maybe not tried a Tier 2 first. It's just a significant need. Or this is a student who was receiving Tier 2, was not making enough progress, and we needed to bump it to a Tier 3. So you can intensify a Tier 2 intervention. Many schools are going to realize that if you are looking at only Tier 3 interventions, it's just going to overwhelm your resources. And so you may find that if you put a lot more effort into Tier 1 for everyone, you will have a lot more success with a lot less students needing specific Tier 3 interventions. So in simpler terms, if we make Tier 1 more intensive, utilizing more evidence-based strategies, then we'll need less students who are receiving Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions. But ways that you can intensify them are utilizing the taxonomy of interventions, where there are 7 categories that you would adjust for a specific intervention. That first element is strength. Strength is that this is the right intervention for that particular student. If you've started an intervention with a student, but maybe you're not seeing the outcome you expected, you may consider some of these questions. Is it an evidence-based intervention? What evidence supports that this particular strategy works with this particular student? And then does this intervention support learners who may have intensive challenges? We may find that some students are really successful with a particular strategy and other students aren't. And so we need to identify that the strength is intended for a particular audience. Qualified professionals may have specific strengths in identifying the strength of different interventions. So that would be something that would be brought to a team. The dosage is how often a student is responding to and receiving the feedback. So this could be how often they're engaging in the intervention and how often the student maybe needs to engage. For example, you may have a student who is needing this intervention more than once a day. They may need to do an academic check in the morning and then in the afternoon because they need more opportunities. You may find that you need to chunk a student's intervention. So instead of doing a block 30 minutes, maybe they'll do 10, 10, and 10 throughout the day. A behavior intervention may happen throughout the day. So there may need to be more than just 2 opportunities. You may find that a student really has difficulty sitting for long periods of time, and so their intervention may be shorter. It's really thinking about that student, thinking about those opportunities. Most critically, and likely most often, interventions are done at a period of time that's fairly consistent. And if a student is not present during those times, for whatever reason, they're tardy, they have absences, we may need to consider elements to support them to get to those interventions, meaning we are going to adjust the time, we're going to add on an additional element for them to receive that support. So those would be also changes to dosage. The alignment is how well that intervention matches the academic skills or behaviors of concern. So if we know that this particular student has a phonological issue and a skill deficit there, we want to be sure that the intervention is targeting that phonological skill deficit. We also want to make sure that this intervention is responding to the grade and the expected ability of the student, meaning that it's not so significantly easy and it's not so significantly difficult. When we think about attention to transfer, we want to be sure that the intervention is able to help students to make connections between how we're teaching that skill and how they can utilize that skill without the intervention. It's not helpful for a student to go through an intervention process if that information is only applicable because we did it within this context. We need the student to be able to go beyond what they just learned with their teacher. So we also want to think about how it relates to grade level standards or the progression of how they are learning. For example, many of our state standards will use specific verbs, and especially in literacy, a lot of those standards build upon one another. So for example, you may have in a lower elementary class identify information, so you want a student to find or identify something, but then once they get to 3rd grade, they really need to be able to synthesize or analyze. And so we don't want to make our intervention so narrow that when they're in 1st grade, they can just point to things, but we haven't allowed them to think of it beyond just pointing and identifying. We want to think about how this intervention can support them in their universal instruction. So we want them to be able to utilize it, to transfer it to how they are engaging in the classroom with their Tier 1 counterparts. When we're thinking about this student, we want them to be able to transfer the skill. We don't want to have a student that's on an intervention for every single strategy. We want people to be able to transfer it so that they have an easier time adjusting to the next skill. Comprehensiveness is how explicit the instruction is. We want the teacher to be very explicit, meaning that they're not going to leave anything to assumption for the student. But as students become more comfortable, they may need less explicit instruction, and as students become less comfortable, they may need more explicit instruction. It also depends how the teacher is utilizing, how the explicit instruction is provided. Is the student responding? Do they understand what the teacher is describing? The last component, well, not the last component, but the last area that we're really going to talk about is specific to the behavioral or academic support. Behavioral or academic support relates to whether or not we need to add on one of those additional supports. So if we have a student who's utilizing a visual schedule, typically that's a pretty easy behavioral intervention, but it doesn't help if the student doesn't know how to read or doesn't know how to access those pictures. And academic support is fantastic, but it doesn't help if the student doesn't come to the table or doesn't engage. So we may need an additional behavior support to help them to access their intended intervention. The last element is individualization, and this really comprises of utilizing data. So perhaps we have a student who is needing quite intense individualization, and we need to evaluate whether or not their targeted goal is reasonable for them. If we're making these decisions for individualization, we really need to think about how we're measuring and how we're using our data-driven decisions to evaluate and make sure that a student is not being overly challenged, but also not being underserved. This leads us into our data-driven decisions category, where we are thinking about this MTSS team and how they're going to identify procedures and processes to assist in determining risk and targeted skill deficits. We want these to match so that they match their level of support. And it really occurs at all levels, from individual students to district level. This is the team that's going to help us to know if we need a district level initiative or if it's just this one isolated circumstance with one student. We need to consider these pieces of information because we don't want to have rules or procedures that are overly limiting, but we also don't want to have rules and procedures that don't support us, that leave us in a constant loop of not being sure if a student really is progressing or not. So the most basic is that we need some measurement tools. We need to identify how we're going to collect data and what types of data we need to collect. We need effective screening tools and processes for those screening tools so that we can begin to support those students who have skill deficits. So most critically, when we think about the assessments that students are taking, the largest, least sensitive is that state assessment. The state test serves its purpose for other areas, but it's not going to give us specific information about each individual student. It's not going to tell us which letters the student doesn't know. It's not going to tell us, very specific information. So we need a screening tool that we can conduct more frequently that demonstrates this information so that we can utilize this information for our district and sites. The state assessment's useful for the state, but the districts and sites need this information for their screening to identify where we have skill deficits. These are still large buckets. Then we need that progress monitoring piece that's even more frequent so that we can see when we're making a change. These changes are more sensitive. So we need these processes so that we can identify these pieces of information. And then we're not just saying, well, the student had a bad day on this day. We have more tools that are helping us to make these informative decisions. It's also important for teams to have a structure to analyze graphic results. Many schools, screeners will have this, but that's also not to say that every school is going, or every screener is going to graph them the way that it makes the most sense. So we need a strategy to be able to read the data. And graphic results really help to make sense of numeric values. Once we have these tools, then we need our process. We need to know how we're going to identify what are big needs and how we're going to identify these interventions and practices. And we need to really critically know, maybe this data still isn't enough. For example, our screener is likely not going to tell us what letters a student is missing, and sometimes even our progress monitoring tool isn't going to do that. So we may need an additional source called a diagnostic assessment, and that would tell us those pieces of information. Districts and sites also need to think about those different levels. So we may need to identify, at a district level that the district as a whole has a significant skill deficit in a specific literacy area. But maybe that literacy area is changing annually, and we need to reevaluate those decision rules. So maybe in 1 year, we're going to put a lot of focus in phonics, and then we notice that we have less students that need Tier 2 and Tier 3 supports in phonics. and that's fantastic. But we may notice that we have more students who need support in comprehension. So when we're thinking of these identifying needs and selecting interventions, we really need to do this on all levels, whether it's just the district, site, and student. All of these are comprised to help us make adequate decisions. Once we've identified that a student needs to be identified for a particular intervention, then we need to group that student with those intervention protocols. And we should be utilizing this based on skill needs. Some large districts may have many students that have the same intervention skill need. Others that are smaller may not. However, small districts may be able to overcome some of the grade level barriers where they can group off grade level. Again, that's going to come down to your particular context and your particular students. You don't have to do every intervention individually. Small groups are appropriate for intervention, and interventions really need to be focused on those particular skills. When we're thinking about now what, we've done it, we've looked at the data, we've identified how we're going to intervene. Now we need to determine if it's working. And we need to determine if it's working at all levels. We need to determine if we made it our focus that we're working on phonics at a district level, that that's really supportive of phonics improvement. We also need to inform our data, use our data to inform instructional changes and how we're going to use teachers to evaluate different levels of instruction or different evidence-based practices just in their core instruction. When a student's provided an intervention, we need to progress monitor that individual student's interventions. So while we may be doing a progress monitoring for a group of students on a regular enough basis, we need to definitely make sure that if we're looking at a specific student, that progress monitoring piece is what we're looking at for that response to intervention. However, you may find that you really do benefit from progress monitoring with the class and school and district level interventions. You may find that you need some of that information to see that there's a system level change. Those decisions that you make and how often you do it and who's going to do it, those are all of your district procedures and what's specific to your particular structure. What's most important is that it's consistent. Consistency is the most critical when it comes to MTSS, because consistency really ensures that we are consistently looking at all of these pieces and that we're consistently providing these opportunities for students. If I am doing something with a student on a regular enough basis, I should be able to evaluate whether or not that student is making a response to the intervention appropriately. If I am not doing that consistently, it's too difficult for me to say that my intervention was supported in any way. I need to be able to evaluate whether or not there's consistency in my team and in my defined processes. So it's really important that from one day to the next, we're doing those specific standardized protocols standard. That if I'm working on an intervention with a student, I am consistently doing it the same way. That's really important. If I'm giving a student extra help one day or not enough help the next day because I am feeling like I should be doing that, that's not going to give me really great data. It is really going to make it difficult for the team to make any decisions for that student beyond. I think a lot of the time when we think about MTSS and beginning this process, it gets a little overwhelming because there are a lot of components that all seem to have varying critical elements. But MTSS is never really over. It's a practice that's recursive and ever-changing. If we have a proactive framework, that means that we need to account for the fact that teams are evolving, that they have new staff, new students, new skills, and that sometimes new problems arise, and sometimes new successes occur. And we find out that something's really working that we really put a lot of effort for. So schools need to consider these processes often and continue with their new learning so that they can improve their processes. the way that we've done RTI over the years, the process necessarily hasn't changed, but the ways that we conduct it, the ways that we can support students, the specific categories that are available, those pieces have improved. So instead of thinking MTSS is this curriculum or this program that we're going to do, and we're engaging in MTSS now, and so now we have to go buy all these things, think about it more like a framework aligned to what you're already doing, and it's really intended to support all students. It's not just a thing we're going to purchase. It's not just a tool that is just suddenly going to work for students. It's purposeful, and it's aligned to what we're doing in our particular context. Instead of thinking, well, this is a lot of work for special education students, think about how many of our students maybe weren't even eligible with a traditional discrepancy model and needed extra support anyway. Think about how many students would benefit from just some additional support and some additional identification. Sometimes schools will say, well, our special education population, they're not passing these tests anyway. Well, we should have high expectations for all of our students, including those students who have disabilities. When we think about MTSS as, well, this is really great for elementary, think about how we can adopt that for all grade levels. How that's going to look is going to require some flexibility. Some schools find a lot of benefit in having a specific intervention block or time in their secondary, meaning that they're going to isolate a specific area for them to go to, or maybe they take an elective to support them. Other schools that maybe have, maybe are smaller, can really adapt an intervention process where teachers are providing interventions, maybe not necessarily for their same matched subject area. And we're teaching teachers how to do those standardized protocols. When we're thinking about MTSS, instead of thinking, well, this seems new, or this will just go away, MTSS isn't really that new. It's been around since 2007, when it was then introduced under the National Center on Response to Intervention. But response to intervention has been a requirement of IDEA since 2004, and response to intervention has really been around since before 1970, when it was the tool that we were just utilizing to support students and their data collection. So some key takeaways is that MTSS is effective instructional processes. It seams up all of your existing tools and puts them in a process that's specific to your school and your district. When you're thinking about RTI, PBIS, MTSS, we really got heavy with the acronyms. They're all combined to form this one element of MTSS. And if we're thinking about needing another reason for why this is supportive, if we have an effective Tier 1, which the majority of our students fall under, and the majority of our students need higher intensity support, if that's more effective, we will reduce the needs for a significant Tier 2 and Tier 3. MTSS can support both elementary and secondary with coordination at the district, as well as academics and behavior. And it's continuous. There's never a done element, and that can be kind of stressful or anxiety inducing, but that's not really the goal. The goal is not to ever be done. The goal is to feel comfortable in the ways that we support students and to know that there are effective processes for how we're going to engage with students. If you need additional information, we've developed an introductory guide, and we have our MTSS website. We also host communities of practice that are monthly. They're virtual, where we use experts in the field from Oklahoma and our external partners to discuss and describe some of these challenges and how they've found successes. We also have an OSDE Connect course that you can utilize as one of your MTSS free opportunities for coaching. This is a course that your district or site would engage in together and utilize to build the processes and the next steps for your team to have an MTSS system. Thank you so much for listening and engaging with MTSS, and we're excited for your partnership as we continue building our MTSS system.